Welcome to the Metamorphosis Podcast, where we explore the possibilities and processes of personal and community transformation based on the ancient wisdom of Kemet, one of many classical African civilizations, as a foundation. I am Dr. Catherine Lynn Adams, an associate professor of African and African American Studies at Claflin University, where I teach courses on oral and literary traditions of the African world, with an emphasis on interviewing and archiving the stories of our elders. I am serving as a scribe for this project. Joining me is Baba Derrick Jackson. Baba Derrick is the priest and thought leader of Christ Universal Temple, a spiritual community in South Carolina. This is the last of 3 personal installments. We hope you enjoy.
Growing up in Harlem gave me a sense of, let me put it this way, a confidence that I could take on the challenges of life and overcome them. That I didn't have to accept what people gave me as the only truth there is out there. Growing up, especially coming of age in the late 60s and early 70s, when there was a social change, definitely allowed me to explore possibilities. And so by the time I was to leave Harlem and going into the military, and venture into that life, it might have had some intrepidation about it. And my biggest memory about it is they have these long hallways in the apartment complex my parents and I lived in. And we lived at the end of one side of the hallway, and me walking down that long hallway with my mother standing at the door, looking and watching her son leave home. And I was never to return to New York to live again. And so that's probably why that memory is still, and I had to walk all the way to the elevator. I pushed the button, turned around, and saw her at the door. And I can still see it now to this very day. Her standing there. And it was as if she knew that once I left New York, I wasn't coming back to New York. She hoped that I would, but I think she knew because she went through it with her brother. And I kind of followed my uncle's footsteps because he was in the Air Force. In fact, that informed me because that summer, that August of 74, I spent 45 days with him in England, where he was stationed. My best friend at the time, his name was John Skinner. And see, that's why I have to think about time periods, because friends changed over time periods because of location. So during that time period, it was a guy named John Skinner who lived in the same apartment complex I did. In fact, his apartment was directly underneath the one I lived. You know, and I call his mother, his last name was Skinner, I call his mother Mama Skinner. So, and he called my mother Mama Jackson. And so we were in and out of each other's house so much you couldn't tell we weren't actual brothers. Till this very day, we still call each other even though he's living in Jersey and I live here in South Carolina. But that confidence to take on whatever I was heading toward, because I had no idea what I was heading toward on that day.
What were your parents' names?
Albert Jackson, and my mother didn't like her middle name, but I knew my grandfather very well, and he used to say, "I named you," and he would call her Sarah May. I'm telling you, my grandfather was something else, man. You know, I said, I'm so glad he loved his grandchildren. Because
It's a different relationship.
it's a different relationship. He was hard on them boys, though. And my mother sometimes didn't pay attention to him. But my mother grew up because her mother died very early in life, in her life. And so I think my mother was about 13 when her mother transitioned, 13, 14. So she was the only female. And so my grandfather made sure that those boys, as he said, you take care of your sister. I don't care what goes on, you make sure that your sister is okay. Because my mother had to step up. At 13, he was working in a mill in Norristown, Pennsylvania. And so because he was working in the mill, those long hours in that mill meant that she was the one that was cooking the food and taking care of the boys, right? And until he reached an age where he had to retire. But I found out my grandfather was quite an entrepreneur. People houses that we used to go to and he'd take me with him. I thought he was just visiting. He owned the house and he was collecting rent. But the way, talk about that governance conversation, the way that they talk, he would talk to the people in there and they would sit and they'd have coffee and they would be just communicating with each other in a friendly. I never saw money exchange hands. It wasn't until I got much older that I realized that's what he was doing. He was just going around to the different places that he owned in Norris, apartments that he owned in Norristown, and houses, and collecting the rent for that time. But because they had more than just a manager landlord relationship, they would sit, talk, have company, have coffee, talk over all kinds of things that were going on in that small town at that time.
So what's that timeline between Norristown, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina for the Ellises?
I really don't know, because it had to be during the time my mother was a teenager.
So she probably spent most of
her early years were
and
here
growing up
in St. Matthews, South Carolina. Okay. And there came a time when my grandfather left here and moved to Norristown, Pennsylvania. My grandfather had two sisters that lived in Brooklyn, New York. Okay. And then he had a brother, an older brother that lived, who was a preacher, that lived in Norristown already. So he went to stay with his older brother. And then eventually he moved out on his own in Norristown.
This is one of the things that rankles me a little bit about Ralph, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man,
Mm-hmm.
when he has the alienated character who leaves the South and he goes up to the city and he's in this basement, with like 1,000 light bulbs and no family.
Right.
And I don't know anybody who has that story, except for if you're trying to make a point about alienation, which,
And I'm not sure that's true because, well, let me put it this way: in the circle of family that I was around, there were no strangers from South Carolina. Okay, you came up and somebody from South Carolina knew you as a South Carolinian. There was like a network of people who would try to help you get on your feet. Now, they're not going to babysit you, nothing like that, but you're a place to stay, food in your stomach, and maybe even some clothes to wear. They were going to do that. And it didn't matter whether you were from St. Matthews or Columbia or any place, Bennettsville. If you were from South Carolina, the people I was happy to be around, there was a network. And a lot of times they didn't know the people who they were taking care of. All they knew the person who introduced them to that person, but they may not know the person themselves. And they would introduce, this is so and so. Yeah, he's from Hartsville, South Carolina. Yeah, Hartsville. And what's your family name? That was so when you're reading Ralph Ellison, I'm like, really? I didn't know that. That was not the experience of people in my family, at least, and I saw around the neighborhood. There was this honest way of seeing and watching, even some of the people in our family who we thought other people might have thought was crazy. My Uncle Rock, man, like, he had a reputation in those streets, right? But he also had a reputation in the streets as the most giving person. My uncle got drafted into the Army around 62, 63. When he came back from the Army, anything he had, man, he just had a heart for the homeless. At that time period, he would give away clothes. He would do all kinds of things. He would bring people to the house and tell sis, that's my mom's, right? Hey, sis, this guy hungry. We can feed him, can't we? And see, I didn't know how poor we were at the time because my uncle used to bring people up all the time, right? and I didn't know what adults were doing, looking at each other, right? I know now, but at the time, all I knew, that was another mouth to feed. And in those days, lima beans and black eyed peas went a long way, right? But, and this is probably why, Dr. Adams, I'm so attached to not only relationships, but reciprocity. Now that you made me think about it, was when the blackout hit in 65, I think it was, the first one, 65, 66. My mother used to work in upstate New York, Arsenic, New York, at the VA hospital. And she had to find her way back home from Arsenic, New York, because the whole city was out. And the problem was trains. There was a train that took you up there, and it could only bring you back but so far. So she had to take a cab from where they dropped her off home. When she opened the door, me, my brother, and my father were already in the house. So she's telling the story. When she opened that cab door and stepped out, all those people that my uncle had brought and my mother and father had fed, who were around at that particular time, she said one of them just yelled out, "Hey, that's Rock Sister." And they came, almost making me cry, think about it. Hold it. But and walked my mother up the 5 flights of stairs to the 5th floor to make sure she got home safe. Just thinking about it now, because when my dad opened that door and my moms was standing there and those guys were standing around her, I thought that at that time as a kid, 65, I'm 12 years old. And seeing that just left an indelible mark till this very day. I'm 70 years old and still emotional about it.
That's a good place for us to end. That's a good place. We want to archive something special that was established in 2000, more than 2 decades ago. In upcoming episodes, we will be exploring the history of Christ Universal Temple, its teachings on spirituality and personal growth, and its role in the Columbia, South Carolina community. We invite you to like, comment, and subscribe to receive notifications for future episodes. Thank you for listening.